My name is Emma. I'm in my mid-30s now, but this story begins when I was still learning how to take up space without apologizing for it. At the time, I worked in a corporate environment that prized efficiency, loyalty, and appearances, especially the appearance of harmony. I wasn't loud. I wasn't confrontational. I didn't command rooms when I entered them. Most people describe me as dependable, thoughtful, and easy to work with. The kind of person you trust with responsibility, but rarely with power. People often assume that silence means consent, or that calm means compliance. I let them believe that for a long time. Not because I was afraid, but because I was observant. I noticed how often the loudest voices were rewarded for confidence, while quieter ones were mistaken for agreement. I noticed how decisions were framed as collective, even when they clearly benefited only a few. And I noticed how quickly discomfort was smoothed over with titles, perks, or polite smiles. This is not a story about revenge. There are no dramatic outbursts here, no villains exposed in public meetings, no moments designed for applause. What happened unfolded slowly, internally at first, and then, almost invisibly, around me. It's a story about awareness, about choosing restraint over reaction, and about understanding the difference between being valued and being useful. At one point, I was offered a promotion to keep me quiet. It came wrapped in praise and positioned as recognition. Most people would have called it a win, and for a brief moment, I almost did too. But there was something about the timing, the wording, the sudden generosity that made me pause. Later, I would understand why. The raise was cheaper than the truth. What you'll hear over the next hour or so is an honest account of how I moved from being underestimated to being unignorable, without raising my voice, without burning bridges, and without becoming someone I didn't respect. This story is about emotional justice, not emotional release. About what happens when you stop explaining yourself and start documenting instead. If you're expecting drama, you might be disappointed. If you're looking for clarity, patience, and the quiet power of self-trust, you might recognize parts of yourself here. I'm sharing this not to settle scores, but because I know how isolating it can feel to sense that something is wrong while everyone else insists everything is fine. So before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever felt rewarded for your silence and wondered what it was really costing you? To them, I was reliable in the way furniture is reliable. I was the person who remembered deadlines without reminders, who filled in gaps without being asked, who stayed late when timelines slipped and never made a show of it. I wasn't invisible in the sense that people forgot my name. They knew exactly who I was. They just didn't see me as someone whose perspective altered outcomes. In meetings, my presence was acknowledged with a nod, sometimes a smile. My suggestions were often met with silence. Not disagreement, just a kind of pause that moved on without friction. 5 minutes later, someone else would say something remarkably similar, and the room would warm to it. Heads would lift, pens would move. That idea would suddenly have weight. I used to wonder if I imagined that pattern. I replayed conversations in my head, checking my tone, my timing, my wording. Maybe I hadn't been clear enough. Maybe I hadn't sounded confident enough. Maybe I should have spoken sooner, louder, sharper. Those were the explanations I offered myself, because they were easier than admitting something more uncomfortable, that I had been assigned a role without my consent. At work, I was known as steady. That word came up often in performance reviews. Steady, consistent, dependable, never visionary, never bold, never disruptive. I was praised for smoothing things over, for being flexible, for handling complexity without escalating. I wore those compliments like badges of maturity. I told myself this was what professionalism looked like. What no one said out loud, but everyone behaved as if it were true, was that my steadiness made me safe. Safe to overlook, safe to lean on, safe to keep exactly where I was. I didn't push back. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I was still learning the difference between patience and postponement. I believed that good work spoke for itself, that consistency accumulated, that eventually someone would notice the pattern and connect it to leadership potential. Instead, the pattern was noticed and quietly exploited. I became the person new hires were assigned to shadow, the person executives trusted with sensitive follow-ups, but not strategic decisions. The person who knew how things really worked, yet somehow was never in the room when those things were decided. I was looped in after the fact, asked to implement, to explain, to clean up. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes from being competent. You're not ignored because you're failing. You're ignored because you're useful exactly where you are. Moving you would create inconvenience. Promoting you would create a gap no one wanted to fill. I didn't resent my colleagues. Most of them were decent, busy, operating inside incentives they hadn't designed. I didn't resent my managers either, not yet. They spoke warmly of me. They trusted me. They just didn't challenge the assumptions they'd formed early on, that I preferred stability, that I wasn't interested in power, that I was comfortable supporting rather than leading. And I let those assumptions stand. Outside of work, people describe me similarly. Calm, thoughtful, the listener in the room, the one who asked questions instead of taking the floor. I had learned early in life that attention was conditional, that being agreeable kept things smooth. Silence had once been a form of safety. Over time, it became a habit, but habits have consequences. There were moments, small, sharp ones, when I felt the mismatch between how I was perceived and what I carried internally. When I saw inefficiencies that no one else named. When I anticipated problems months in advance. When I watched decisions being made without data that I knew existed. Because I was the one maintaining it. Each time I told myself, later. Later I'll speak up. Later I'll make my case. Later, when the timing is right. Later became a holding pattern. From the outside, my career looked stable, even enviable. Good title, good salary, trust from leadership. From the inside, something was quietly eroding. Not my confidence exactly, but my willingness to offer it freely. I started paying closer attention, not to what people said, but to what changed after they spoke. Who gained influence? Who remained unchanged? That was who I was to them. The constant. The background assurance that things would keep running. At the time, I still believed that constancy would eventually be rewarded with visibility. I didn't yet understand that visibility, in some systems, is something you have to stop providing quietly before it's ever acknowledged. The first time it happened, it was small enough to dismiss. We were in a mid-level planning meeting, 8 of us, gathered around a table with coffee going cold and laptops half open. The agenda was routine. I had spent the previous week reviewing operational data, flagging a potential bottleneck that would surface within the next quarter if nothing changed. It wasn't dramatic, just structural. The kind of issue that never makes headlines, but slowly drains resources if ignored. When my turn came, I spoke the way I always did. Measured, factual, brief. I explained the pattern, referenced the data, and suggested a minor adjustment that would cost almost nothing to implement. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was trying to prevent a problem. There was a pause, not an awkward one, just a neutral silence. Then the meeting moved on. No questions, no objections, no acknowledgement beyond a polite okay. I told myself they'd absorbed it, that not every useful contribution needed a response. I even felt a small sense of relief. Less discussion meant less friction. 20 minutes later, the same issue resurfaced, this time framed differently. A colleague, well-liked, confident, not particularly close to the details, raised a concern about future scalability. He spoke in broad strokes, without numbers. He didn't propose a solution, just flagged the risk. The room shifted. People leaned in. Someone asked him to elaborate. Another person built on his point. The conversation unfolded almost exactly along the lines I had outlined earlier, only now it had energy. I remember sitting there, my hands folded, watching my own thoughts circulate without my name attached. There was no anger, just a quiet internal recalibration, a recognition. No one looked at me. No one said, "Emma mentioned this earlier." Not out of malice, I think, more out of momentum, ideas. once detached from their source, tend to belong to whoever delivers them at the right volume. After the meeting, I considered saying something. Not confrontational, just a casual follow-up. But the moment passed. People were already standing, chatting, transitioning. I told myself it wasn't worth making things awkward. That credit wasn't the point. That the outcome mattered more. That's what I told myself. The real cut wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the realization that my contributions could be absorbed, reframed, and reissued without resistance, and that the system didn't see a problem with that. That my silence smoothed the process in ways that benefited everyone but me. In the days that followed, I watched more closely. I noticed how often ideas gained traction only after being repeated by certain voices. How authority seemed less about accuracy and more about expectation. I noticed how often I was asked to provide background, context, or clarification after decisions were already leaning in a particular direction. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, and I wasn't sure yet that I should be. I told myself this was normal workplace dynamics, that I was being sensitive, that everyone experienced this occasionally. I reminded myself of my values: collaboration over ego, impact over credit. Those were real values. I still believe in them. But values, when unexamined, can become vulnerabilities. The moment that stayed with me came later that afternoon. A brief email circulated summarizing the meeting's outcomes. The flagged risk was listed. The proposed solution was included. It was attributed to the group with a special note thanking the colleague who had raised the issue. I read that line twice. It wasn't wrong enough to challenge. It wasn't personal enough to escalate. It was just accurate enough to pass as consensus. And in that narrow space between accuracy and truth, something shifted. I didn't feel hurt. I felt informed. This wasn't about one meeting or one colleague. It was about pattern recognition. About understanding how easily quiet contributions dissolve into the background unless someone insists on their visibility. I closed the email and went back to work. I did what I always did. Delivered, supported, followed through. But something had changed in how I was paying attention. I started noticing the moments that didn't sting enough to protest, but accumulated anyway. The ones that asked you, silently, what you were willing to accept in exchange for harmony. At the time, I still believed this was a one-off, a minor oversight, a small cut that would heal on its own. I didn't yet understand how many small cuts it takes before you stop feeling them individually and start feeling the loss instead. After that first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It blends in. It arrives disguised as routine, as efficiency, as how things are done here. If I had been openly dismissed or contradicted, I might have reacted. But what followed was quieter than that. So quiet, it almost felt unreasonable to question. The pattern repeated, not identically, but consistently enough to register. I would raise a concern early, framed carefully so it wouldn't sound alarmist. It would be acknowledged with a nod, sometimes a good point. Then it would disappear into the meeting notes, only to re-emerge later, repackaged, usually after a deadline had passed or a consequence had surfaced. At that stage, urgency made it legitimate. At that stage, someone else became its voice. I began to understand that timing mattered more than accuracy. That being early meant being ignorable. Being late meant being necessary. So I adjusted, or at least I told myself I was being strategic. I spoke less in meetings. When I did, I kept it high level. I waited to see where the room was leaning before adding anything. I told myself this was maturity. Reading the room, choosing battles, conserving energy. And in many ways, it was. But it also meant that I was slowly training people to expect less from me, publicly. Privately, my workload didn't decrease. If anything, it increased. I became the person people came to afterward. Can you help me think this through? Do you have more details on that? You always see things early. What do you think? These conversations happened in hallways, over chat messages, in quiet corners where nothing was recorded. I gave thoughtful answers. I shared context. I helped refine ideas that would later appear fully formed in executive updates. At the time, I told myself this was influence, that real impact didn't need attribution, that being a trusted sounding board mattered more than being seen. There was truth in that, but not the whole truth, because influence without visibility is fragile. It depends on goodwill, and goodwill is not a system, it's a mood. I noticed how often my flexibility was assumed. Deadlines would shift without consultation, landing on my desk because you'll handle it. The scope would expand quietly because I didn't push back the last time. I was praised for being low maintenance, which I had once considered a compliment. It took me longer than I like to admit to see that low maintenance often means low priority. Still, I rationalized staying quiet. I told myself I was playing a long game, that consistency would eventually lead to trust, and trust to authority. That I didn't need to assert myself because my work spoke clearly enough. I reminded myself that not everyone wanted leadership, and that it was okay to build a career around expertise rather than visibility. Those were all reasonable thoughts. None of them were lies. They just weren't complete. What I didn't acknowledge was the cost. The way my silence was being interpreted was not as restraint, but as agreement. Not as thoughtfulness, but as a lack of ambition. Each time I chose not to correct an assumption, it hardened slightly. There was also a personal element I hadn't fully examined. Growing up, I learned early that being easy made life smoother. That challenging authority came with consequences. That being useful kept you included. Those lessons don't disappear just because you're older or more capable. They adapt. They use professional language. So when something felt off, my instinct wasn't to confront. It was to absorb, to adjust internally, to stay composed. And for a while, that worked. My performance reviews remained positive. My role expanded. I was trusted with more complexity, more sensitive information. I was told I was indispensable, a word that should have felt reassuring, but instead landed with an odd weight. Indispensable to what? And in what position? I remember one conversation with a manager who praised my reliability and then, almost in the same breath, explained why a stretch opportunity was going to someone else. "They're just more vocal about wanting it," he said kindly, as if desire were something you demonstrated by volume. I nodded. I thanked him for the feedback. I told him I understood. And in that moment, I made a choice, not consciously but reflexively, to keep my discomfort private, to normalize it, to treat it as the price of being respected for my work, if not my voice. It wasn't until later that I realized how dangerous that normalization was, how easily it trains you to accept conditions you would never advise someone else to tolerate, how quietly it erodes your sense of what is reasonable. At the time, though, I still believed I was being patient, strategic, professional. I didn't yet see that I was participating in my own diminishing, not through inaction, but through accommodation. And accommodations, once made often enough, start to look like consent. I didn't realize I had been cast until I started noticing how predictable my part had become. In every project, every cross-functional initiative, every all-hands push, there was an unspoken understanding of who did what. There were the vision people, the ones who spoke first, framed the narrative, set the tone. There were the decision makers whose questions subtly guided outcomes. And then there were the stabilizers. That was me. I was the one brought in to make sure ideas actually worked, to translate ambition into process, to anticipate friction before it surfaced. When something was unclear, I clarified it. When something broke, I fixed it. When tensions rose, I smoothed them down. It was a valuable role, necessary even, but it was also a limiting one. The more effective I became at stabilizing, the less anyone imagined me destabilizing anything, even when it needed it. My reliability had turned into a kind of ceiling. I was trusted to support decisions, not to shape them, to execute, not to challenge, to be consulted privately, not acknowledged publicly. No one ever said this out loud. Roles like this are rarely assigned directly. They're inferred, reinforced through repetition. Each time I stepped in to help without being asked, the role solidified. Each time I chose harmony over visibility, it became easier for others to assume I preferred it that way. There was a moment of clarity that came during a leadership offsite. I wasn't officially part of the leadership group, but I was invited to support logistics and follow-ups. It's odd, she said, that phrasing alone should have told me something. During one session, a complex operational risk was being discussed. I had deep familiarity with it, more than anyone in the room. I listened as assumptions were made, as timelines were compressed optimistically, as dependencies were overlooked. I waited for a pause to offer context. It never came. Instead, the conversation moved toward consensus, built on incomplete understanding. I could have interrupted. I could have asked for a moment. I didn't. I watched the decision settle, knowing exactly how it would play out months later. Afterward, one of the leaders pulled me aside. "We're so glad you were there," she said. "You always make sure things don't fall apart." It was meant as a compliment. I smiled. I thanked her. And inside, something hardened, not into resentment, but into clarity. I wasn't being overlooked by accident. I was being positioned by function. I had become the insurance policy, not the architect. The person you rely on when things go wrong, but rarely the one you ask to imagine what could go right differently. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction seemed to reinforce the same expectation. When I raised concerns, they were treated as implementation details, not strategic considerations. When I expressed interest in growth, it was interpreted as wanting more of the same but bigger, more responsibility, not more authority. And I played along, partly because I was good at it, partly because challenging the role would have required friction I wasn't yet ready to introduce. There's a strange comfort in being needed, in being the one people depend on. It can feel like security, but need is not the same as respect. And indispensability, when it's one-directional, becomes a trap. I started to see how the system benefited from my predictability, how my calm presence absorbed risk without redistributing credit, how my willingness to stay behind the scenes allowed others to stay visible. Still, I didn't confront anyone, not because I lacked the words, but because I was beginning to understand leverage. Confrontation, I realized, only works when the other party believes they might lose something. At that point, no one believed they might lose me. They believed I would adapt, that I would continue to be reliable regardless of how decisions were made, that I would absorb the consequences quietly, because I always had. And they were right, up to a point. What they didn't see was that my understanding of the role had changed. I was no longer confused by it or flattered by it. I saw it clearly for what it was, a function designed to maintain stability, not to share power. Once you recognize the role you've been assigned, you face a choice. You can continue to perform it unconsciously, or you can begin to decide deliberately how long you're willing to play it. At the end of that offsite, I packed my notebook, the same one I'd been using for years. And for the first time, I didn't just jot down action items. I started writing questions about ownership, about visibility, about what would happen if the stabilizer stopped stabilizing. I didn't have answers yet, but I knew, with quiet certainty, that I couldn't unknow what I had just learned. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no moment where someone crossed a line so clearly that I was forced to respond. If anything, the day itself was unremarkable. That's what made it unsettling. It happened in the middle of routine, when my guard was down. I was reviewing a quarterly report late in the afternoon, the office already thinning out. The building had that end-of-day quiet, the kind that makes your thoughts louder. I was cross-checking figures against projections when I noticed a discrepancy. Not an error exactly, but a selective omission. A decision that had been made months earlier, one I had advised against, was being presented as a success, without reference to the downstream costs it had quietly created. Those costs lived in my domain. I had absorbed them, managed them, explained them to my team so leadership wouldn't have to answer uncomfortable questions. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I didn't understand what I was seeing, but because I did. This wasn't an oversight. It was a narrative, and I had been helping maintain it. I scrolled back through older documents, emails, and meeting notes, not with suspicion, but with a new lens. I saw how often my cautions had been softened in summaries, how my conditional language had been removed, how my follow-ups had been reframed as confirmations. None of it was egregious. That was the point. Each change on its own was defensible. Together, they told a story that benefited certain people and relied on my silence to remain intact. That was the moment something shifted, not emotionally, but ethically. I realized that my quiet wasn't neutral. It was being used. My restraint wasn't just protecting relationships. It was protecting a version of events that wasn't fully honest. And by continuing to play my role without question, I was complicit. I closed the report and leaned back in my chair. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Clarity is different from outrage. It doesn't rush you. It steadies you. I thought about all the times I had told myself that staying quiet was the mature choice, that speaking up would create unnecessary tension, that the system would self-correct. And I understood, finally, that systems don't correct themselves. They respond to incentives. My silence had been an incentive, not to mistreat me necessarily, but to continue operating without full accountability. I went for a walk before heading home, letting the city noise pull me out of my head. As I walked, I asked myself a simple question. What would change if I stopped smoothing things over? The answer wasn't dramatic. There would be confusion, discomfort, delays, questions that hadn't been asked before. But there would also be accuracy, and maybe finally, alignment between responsibility and authority. That night, I didn't draft an email. I didn't plan a conversation. I didn't rehearse anything. I did something much quieter. I opened my notebook and began writing, not observations, but facts, dates, decisions, who had said what and when, what I had recommended, and how it had been implemented instead. I didn't editorialize. I didn't assign blame. I just recorded. It felt almost boring, methodical. But there was something grounding about it. For the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood in the moment. I was preserving truth over time. That was the internal shift. I also made a decision, though I wouldn't have described it that way then. I decided to stop filling in gaps automatically, to let questions hang longer, to answer exactly what was asked, not what I anticipated someone might need to hear to feel comfortable. It wasn't about withdrawal. It was about precision. Over the following days, I noticed how often I had been preemptively managing other people's reactions, softening language, anticipating objections, framing things to avoid tension. I stopped doing that, not abruptly, but deliberately. The effect was subtle but immediate. Conversations slowed. People asked for clarification. Meetings ran longer. Small inefficiencies surfaced. No one connected this to me, of course. They just experienced it as friction. As things are feeling a bit harder lately, and for the first time, that friction didn't make me anxious. It made me attentive. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else. There was no announcement, no boundary drawn out loud. But internally, something fundamental had changed. I was no longer confusing silence with professionalism. I was choosing it. And that choice, I would soon learn, made all the difference. Once I recognized that my silence had been automatic, choosing it felt strangely powerful. Not dramatic power. No one noticed a shift in my posture or my tone. There were no declarations. Externally, I was the same Emma, calm, cooperative, composed. Internally, though, silence had changed from reflex to strategy. I stopped volunteering context unless it was explicitly requested. I answered questions fully, but narrowly. If someone asked for confirmation, I confirmed, without adding the caveats I used to include to protect outcomes. If a plan was incomplete, I let its incompleteness exist in the open, instead of quietly compensating for it behind the scenes. At first, this felt almost irresponsible. I had built my professional identity around anticipating needs, around preventing failure before it had a chance to surface. Letting things wobble, even slightly, went against every instinct I had developed. But wobble is not collapse, and allowing others to experience the natural consequences of their assumptions was not sabotage. It was accurate. People began to mistake my restraint for disengagement. "Everything okay?" someone asked in passing, noticing that I hadn't chimed in during a meeting where I normally would have. I smiled and said yes. And it was true. I was more okay than I had been in a long time. Others interpreted my quiet as agreement. That wasn't new. What was new was that I no longer rushed to correct that interpretation. I let the record speak later, because now there was a record. My notebook filled steadily, not with opinions, but with sequences. If a decision was made without my input, I noted it. If my recommendation was overridden, I documented both versions. If I were asked to implement something I hadn't endorsed, I would confirm instructions in writing. Nothing I did was confrontational. It was procedural, professional, almost invisible. That invisibility worked in my favor. The people around me were used to my presence as a stabilizing force. They assumed that if I didn't object, things were fine. They didn't notice that I had stopped cushioning outcomes. They didn't realize that the margin for error they had grown accustomed to was gone. Small things started slipping. A timeline was missed because a dependency hadn't been clarified early enough. A resource constraint became visible because I hadn't quietly reallocated effort to cover it. A stakeholder asked a question that, in the past, I would have anticipated and answered preemptively. None of these were crises, but together, they created a sense of unease. Meetings began to include more follow-up questions. Emails grew longer. People asked for clarity more often. The system, deprived of its silent shock absorber, had to adjust. And still, no one blamed me. Why would they? From their perspective, I was doing exactly what I had always done, responding when asked, delivering what was requested, maintaining composure. The difference was what I no longer did, and absences are harder to accuse than actions. I was careful not to let this turn into resentment. That would have shown. Strategy fueled by bitterness always leaks. Instead, I treated this period like an experiment. What happens if I let reality present itself without translation? What happened was revealing. People began to speak more cautiously in my presence, not because they feared me, but because they were no longer sure I would catch them if they fell. Authority without a safety net behaves differently. At the same time, I felt a subtle shift in how I saw myself. I wasn't waiting to be noticed anymore. I wasn't hoping someone would connect the dots and reward me for restraint. I was observing how value actually moved through the organization, what was protected, what was exposed, and why. That observation sharpened my patience. I didn't rush to act on what I was learning. I didn't announce boundaries. I let patterns emerge fully so I could understand them without distortion. Silence, when chosen, creates space. Space to listen more accurately. Space to see where accountability truly lived. Space to decide what kind of outcome I wanted. Not emotionally, but structurally. There was also a personal reckoning in this phase. I had to confront how much of my self-worth had been tied to being needed, to be the one who made things work. Letting go of that identity felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, but it also felt honest. I wasn't disappearing. I was repositioning, and while others interpreted my quiet as compliance or fatigue, I knew better. I was conserving energy, information, options, because silence, when it's no longer automatic, stops being a void. It becomes leverage. What they never noticed was how much time I spent watching, not watching people in a suspicious way, but watching systems, how information moved, where it stalled, who it protected, and who it exposed. When you stop performing, you gain bandwidth, and with that bandwidth, I began to see the architecture beneath the culture. I noticed which decisions were documented thoroughly and which were left intentionally vague. Which approvals required email trails and which were handled in quiet conversations that left no trace. I noticed how often urgency was used to bypass review and how frequently that urgency originated from the same few sources. I also noticed how often I was looped in after decisions had been made, not because my input was needed, but because my follow-through was. That distinction mattered. So I started preparing, not for confrontation, but for clarity. I organized my notes, I cross-referenced dates, I saved versions of documents that showed how language had evolved between draft and final. I created a private timeline, not to assign blame, but to understand the sequence, cause and effect, decision and consequence. None of this felt dramatic. It felt like research. At the same time, I began learning in ways that had nothing to do with my current role. I took a quiet interest in governance structures and how accountability was distributed legally and financially within the organization. I read policy documents I had previously skimmed. I paid attention to what was emphasized during compliance training and what was glossed over. I also observed people more carefully, not their personalities, but their incentives. Who needed things to remain ambiguous? Who benefited from speed over accuracy? Who was insulated from outcomes? And who absorbed them? What surprised me most was how little attention anyone paid to me during this phase. My calmness worked like camouflage. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't vocal. I wasn't disruptive. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. So no one imagined I was reevaluating anything. They assumed, as they always had, that I was aligned. That assumption gave me freedom. I asked questions that sounded operational but weren't. Can you clarify when this was approved? Who owns this risk now? Which version should I be referencing? Each question was reasonable on its own. Together, they mapped responsibility. I also began to limit my availability in subtle ways, not refusing work, just creating space, delaying responses slightly, asking for prioritization instead of absorbing everything. This forced decisions that had previously been avoided. It made trade-offs visible. Again, nothing I did was overt. That was important. Overt action invites scrutiny before understanding is complete. I wanted the full picture before anyone realized I was drawing one. Internally, something else was happening. The emotional weight I had been carrying, of being overlooked, of feeling responsible for outcomes I didn't control, began to lift. Not because things had improved, but because I had stopped personalizing structural issues. This wasn't about my worth, it was about alignment. And the more I documented, the clearer it became that alignment was missing in critical areas. Authority and accountability were misaligned. Decisions were being made by people who wouldn't feel the consequences. And those consequences were being managed quietly by people like me. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I knew now that if I ever spoke up, it couldn't be emotional. It would have to be factual, grounded, supported by record. Anything less would be dismissed as opinion. So I kept preparing. Weeks passed, then months. During that time, I was offered praise, new responsibilities, and even subtle signals of trust. Nothing changed structurally, but the surface narrative remained positive. That too was information. They believed the system was stable. They didn't see the quiet accumulation happening beneath it. What they also never noticed was how my sense of loyalty was changing. Not disappearing, refining. Loyalty, I realized, doesn't mean protecting a system from truth. It means protecting people from preventable harm. And sometimes that requires allowing discomfort to surface. By the time I finished my preparation, I wasn't itching to act. I wasn't waiting for a trigger. I wasn't imagining vindication. I felt settled, grounded. I knew exactly what I had, what it meant, and what it didn't. I also knew that whatever came next would be irreversible. Not because of conflict, but because once truth is fully visible, pretending otherwise becomes impossible. What they never noticed was that while they were assuming my silence meant acceptance, I was quietly building a complete picture of how things really worked. And when you understand a system that deeply, you don't need to rush. You just need to choose the moment when accuracy matters more than comfort. The reveal didn't come from a single discovery. There was no dramatic email, no hidden file, no moment where everything suddenly clicked into place. What emerged instead was something quieter and far more unsettling. A complete, coherent picture formed from pieces that had always been visible, just never assembled. It happened one evening as I was reviewing my notes at home. Not out of urgency, out of habit. I had begun doing this weekly, the way some people tidy their desk before Monday. I spread documents across my dining table, aligning timelines, matching decisions to outcomes. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. There was a pattern in how risk was transferred. Certain leaders made decisions quickly, publicly, with confidence. Those decisions created downstream complexity, operational strain, compliance exposure, and financial inefficiencies. That complexity was then absorbed quietly by a small group of people, myself included, who were trusted to handle it, not to question it, not to escalate it, just to make it work. On paper, accountability sat at the top. In practice, responsibility flowed downward. What made this a reveal wasn't that the system was imperfect. All systems are. It was that the imperfection was being obscured deliberately, not through lies, but through omission, through selective framing, through reliance on people like me to maintain coherence between the story and reality. And then I noticed something else. There were moments, documented ones, where my recommendations had not only been ignored, but later reversed quietly, when consequences became unavoidable. The reversals were attributed to new information, even when that information had been available all along. My original cautions were nowhere in the record. That mattered, because it meant that the narrative of competence at the top depended in part on the invisibility of dissent below. I didn't feel triumphant realizing this. I felt sober. Leverage isn't exciting when you understand its weight. It comes with responsibility, with choices that don't have clean edges. What I had wasn't a scandal. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing. It was something more subtle and more powerful. A documented misalignment between authority, accountability, and truth. And I was central to it, not as a perpetrator, but as a stabilizer. The private reveal was recognizing that I was holding more than insight. I was holding risk that had been diffused into my role without being named. Risk that, if surfaced, would require redistribution. I sat with that realization for a long time. What would happen if I did nothing? The system would continue, promotions would happen, narratives would solidify, the costs would remain buried in operational layers, absorbed by people trained not to complain. What would happen if I really spoke with documentation and clarity? There would be discomfort, defensiveness, possibly consequences I couldn't fully predict. The question wasn't what was fair. It was what was accurate. I also understood something else in that moment. Why the promotion would come later. Why had the praise had increased? Why had my workload grown while my authority hadn't? It wasn't malicious. It was economical. Keeping me content was cheaper than restructuring accountability. Titles cost less than truth. Raising costs less than changing. I hadn't been silenced yet, but I could see how it would happen. And that awareness gave me an unexpected calm. Because once you understand the mechanism, you stop taking it personally. You stop hoping it will fix itself. You stop waiting to be seen. You start deciding. I didn't rush to expose anything. That wasn't the point. The point was clarity. Knowing, without doubt, what I held and what it meant. I also checked myself carefully during this phase. I asked whether the ego was involved, whether I wanted recognition, whether part of me wanted to be proven right. The answer surprised me. What I wanted was alignment between what was said and what was done, between who decided and who carried the weight, between responsibility and authority. That's not revenge, that's governance. The private reveal ended one illusion permanently, that my silence was neutral. I could see now that whether I acted or not, I was already part of the system's outcome. The only remaining question was how consciously I wanted to participate. By the end of that week, I closed my notebook with a sense of finality I hadn't felt before. Not urgency, not fear. Readiness. I didn't know exactly when I would act, but I knew that when I did, it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be emotional, and it wouldn't be reversible, because once the truth is documented clearly enough, silence stops being passive. It becomes a choice with consequences. The decision point wasn't marked on a calendar. There was no deadline, no ultimatum, no moment where someone forced my hand. What made it a decision point was that, for the first time, doing nothing became an active choice, with a cost I could now measure. Once you see a system clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you understand your position within it, neutrality disappears. I had 3 options, and I knew them with uncomfortable precision. The first was to stay exactly where I was. Accept the likely promotion when it comes. Take the raise. Enjoy the validation. Continue to absorb complexity quietly, translating decisions into workable reality. This path promised stability and external approval. It also required one thing in return: continued silence about the misalignment I now understood intimately. The second option was to speak up informally. Raise concerns gently. Frame them as suggestions. Trust that the right people would listen and adjust. This was the most tempting option because it felt reasonable and familiar. It also had the highest likelihood of going nowhere. I had already tried versions of this. The system had shown me how it handled soft truth. It rounded off the edges and kept moving. The third option was irreversible. It involved clarity without cushioning, documentation without apology, allowing the truth to exist in its full, unsoftened form, without theatrics, but without protection either. This option didn't guarantee justice. It didn't guarantee safety. What it guaranteed was accuracy. I sat with these options longer than I expected, not because I was afraid, but because I respected the weight of what I was considering. irreversible actions deserve contemplation. I thought about my team, the people downstream from decisions they didn't make. I thought about the normalization of quiet absorption, how many careers quietly bend under the expectation to handle it. I thought about my younger self, who believed patience would eventually translate into authority. And I thought about the version of myself I would have to live with afterward. That was the deciding factor. I realized that if I stayed silent now, it wouldn't be because I was being strategic or professional. It would be because I was choosing comfort over integrity. And I had crossed a threshold where that trade-off no longer felt neutral. What surprised me was how calm the realization was. There was no surge of righteousness, no fantasy of being vindicated. Just a steady sense that one option aligned with who I was becoming and the others didn't. I also recognized something practical. If I acted, I had to do it cleanly. No leaking, no side conversations, no emotional framing. Anything less would undermine the very clarity I was trying to preserve. So I prepared one final time. I reviewed my documentation not to strengthen it, but to ensure it was fair. I removed anything speculative, anything that could be interpreted as a motive rather than a fact. What remained was stark and simple, a sequence of decisions, their documented rationales, and their measurable consequences. I didn't add commentary. The truth didn't need help. The moment of decision came quietly, one morning before work. I was making coffee, standing in my kitchen, watching the light shift across the counter. And I knew, not emotionally, but cognitively, that I was done weighing options. I chose the irreversible one, not because I wanted to expose anyone, not because I wanted recognition, but because I could no longer justify protecting a narrative that required my invisibility to function. Choosing accuracy over comfort changes something fundamental. It doesn't make you brave in the dramatic sense. It makes you settled. The internal debate ends. That day, I didn't feel nervous. I felt resolved. I went to work as usual. I spoke to people normally. I didn't hint at anything. I didn't withdraw. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. Because once a decision is made at that level, quietly, deliberately, action becomes procedural, not emotional, just a matter of sequence. I knew the next steps wouldn't create an immediate impact. I knew there would be a delay between cause and effect. That was fine. I wasn't seeking a reaction. I was seeking alignment. And alignment, I had learned, rarely arrives with noise. It arrives with consequences that make sense only in hindsight. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. That's the part people misunderstand when they imagine moments like this. They expect adrenaline, secrecy, and urgency. What I felt instead was calm, almost administrative. When emotion leaves the equation, you stop rushing, you stop posturing, you simply move in the correct order. I didn't announce anything. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't prepare people emotionally for what was coming. Preparation is often just another form of control. I wasn't interested in managing reactions anymore. I focused on sequence. First, I ensured that my documentation lived outside my personal devices. Secure, time-stamped, complete. Then I clarified my own boundaries. Quietly. I stopped absorbing responsibility that wasn't formally mine. If a decision came without context, I asked for it in writing. If a risk was being transferred, I confirmed ownership explicitly. None of this raised alarms. It looked like a process improvement. Professional diligence, the kind of behavior organizations claim to want. Second, I adjusted my financial and legal posture. Not dramatically, just prudently. I reviewed my contract. I refreshed my understanding of whistleblower protections, not because I intended to accuse anyone, but because accuracy deserves safeguards. I spoke to no one at work about this. I didn't need validation. I needed clarity. Third, I slowed down. Not my output, my reactions. When questions came, I responded thoughtfully, without filling in blanks. When assumptions were made, I let them sit until someone realized they needed confirmation. When meetings ended without resolution, I documented exactly that. This wasn't withdrawal, it was alignment. What surprised me was how little anyone noticed. The system had grown so accustomed to my quiet buffering that it took time to register its absence. Like removing a stabilizer from machinery that still runs, for a while. I continued delivering exactly what was asked of me. No more, no less. That distinction mattered. In the past, I had blurred the line between responsibility and initiative. Now, I respect it. If something wasn't mine to decide, I didn't decide it. If something wasn't mine to fix, I didn't fix it silently. The effect was subtle but cumulative. Delays appeared where none had before. Questions circled back up instead of being quietly resolved below. Decisions required clarification that they previously bypassed. Still, no one connected this to me. Why would they? From the outside, I looked compliant, focused, professional. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't resistant. I wasn't asking for recognition. I was just precise. There was a moment midway through this phase when I was called into a meeting to streamline communication. The tone was friendly, curious. They wanted to know if anything was slowing things down on my end. I listened, I nodded, I answered honestly. I explained that I was aligning more closely with formal processes. I wanted to ensure decisions were clearly owned and documented before execution, that it reduced risk. No one argued with that. You can't argue with accuracy without revealing discomfort with it. After that meeting, nothing changed outwardly, but something shifted underneath. I could feel it in the questions people asked me afterward, more cautious, more specific. The system was adapting, slowly realizing that its assumptions no longer held. I didn't enjoy this phase, but I respected it. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about resisting the urge to be understood prematurely. If I had explained what I was doing, it would have invited negotiation, dilution, compromise framed as collaboration. I wasn't interested in compromise anymore, not at the level of truth. So I stayed quiet, not passively, deliberately. I let documentation accumulate. I let responsibility clarify itself through absence. I let the system reveal how much it relied on unspoken labor. And all the while, I remained steady, polite, unremarkable. People tend to underestimate what isn't noisy. They mistake calm for stasis. They assume that if someone isn't reacting, nothing is happening. That assumption is comforting. It's also dangerous, because by the time consequences begin to surface, the movement that caused them is already complete. The consequences didn't announce themselves either. They arrived the way most real consequences do, quietly, unevenly, and without a clear source. At first, it felt like friction in the air, a slight change in tone, a hesitation where there used to be confidence. A project stalled unexpectedly, not because of a failure, but because no one could agree on who made the next decision. In the past, I would have bridged that gap instinctively, pulling threads together, translating intent into action. This time, I waited. Emails went back and forth. Meetings were scheduled, then rescheduled. Clarifying questions surfaced, questions that should have been asked months earlier. Nothing was wrong exactly. Things were just slower. People began to feel it before they understood it. I noticed it in the way colleagues spoke during meetings. Less certainty, more qualifying language. I think, instead of we know. Possibly, instead of definitely. Authority without its quiet support system loses its smoothness. Then came the first visible miss. A timeline slipped far enough that a senior stakeholder noticed. Not catastrophically, just enough to prompt questions. The kind of questions that make people review notes, retrace steps, and realize how much had been assumed rather than confirmed. I was asked for context. I provided it, calmly, precisely, with references. No commentary? No. I warned you. Just sequence. I could see the shift happen in real time. The moment when people realized that the information they needed had always existed, but had been carried by someone who no longer volunteered it. Confusion followed. Don't panic yet. Just mild disorientation. Meetings grew more cautious. Agendas expanded. People began asking for documentation that had previously been optional. The system was trying to stabilize itself without knowing what it had lost. What struck me most was that no one accused me of anything. Instead, they grew tentative around me. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't evasive. I was helpful in a way that felt different, less interpretive, more literal. And that literalness made gaps impossible to ignore. Another consequence surfaced in performance metrics. Numbers that had always looked acceptable began to tell a different story when viewed without contextual smoothing. A cost that had been absorbed quietly appeared as a variance. A risk that had been managed informally showed up as an exposure. Leadership meetings became more frequent. I wasn't in those rooms, but I could feel their ripple effects, requests for clarification, follow-ups that hadn't been needed before. A subtle urgency is creeping into otherwise familiar workflows. Still, no one connected it to a single cause. That's the thing about systems that rely on invisible labor. When that labor becomes visible by its absence, the effect feels systemic, not personal. People began to express frustration, but not anger. "Things feel harder lately," someone said in passing. "We're missing something," another remarked. They were right. What they were missing wasn't effort. It wasn't commitment. It was the quiet translation layer that had been operating without credit for years. And now that layer was gone. I remained observant, not vindicated. This wasn't satisfying in the way people imagine consequences to be. It was sobering. Watching people struggle with uncertainty I had once shielded them from wasn't gratifying. It was instructive. I also noticed something else. How quickly discomfort travels upward when it can't be absorbed below. Questions that had once stopped at my level began escalating. Decisions were revisited. Rationales were requested. People who had been comfortable with ambiguity suddenly wanted clarity. The organization wasn't unraveling. It was recalibrating. And recalibration is uncomfortable. Through all of this, I stayed consistent. I answered what was asked. I documented what occurred. I didn't fill the silences. I didn't rush resolutions. My calm became conspicuous. At some point, someone joked, lightly, that I had gone very by the book lately. I smiled. That was accurate. The book just hadn't mattered much before. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were operational, measurable, inconvenient, and still, no one had named the truth. Not yet. But I could feel it approaching, the moment when the system would have to decide whether to adapt honestly or attempt a shortcut. That moment I knew would reveal everything. The shift from confusion to urgency happened faster than I expected. Once discomfort reaches the right level, people stop asking what's happening and start asking how to make it stop. That's when the tone changes. Meetings become tighter. Language becomes softer. Concern starts to masquerade as care. I was invited into a conversation that felt different from the others. The calendar description was vague. Check-in. The participants were carefully chosen. The atmosphere, when I entered the room, was polite in a way that signaled something underneath. They told me they valued me, that my work was appreciated, that the organization was going through a complex phase. They asked if I was feeling supported, if there was anything I needed. I listened, I nodded. I answered honestly but minimally. What they were really asking, though they didn't say it, was whether I could help smooth things over again, whether I could resume absorbing complexity quietly, whether I could restore the comfort they had grown used to. That's when the offer appeared, not bluntly, not all at once. It was framed as recognition, a new title, expanded scope, a compensation adjustment, all positioned as overdue acknowledgement of my contributions. I was offered a promotion to keep me quiet. No one said those words. They didn't have to. The timing said everything. The offer didn't come with increased authority over decisions, just more responsibility for outcomes. More visibility, but still downstream. It was designed to make me feel seen without changing the structure that had created the problem. The raise was cheaper than the truth. I felt no anger in that moment, just confirmation. They weren't trying to deceive me. They were trying to stabilize the system using the tool that had always worked before, my willingness to accommodate. I asked for time to consider it. That request alone shifted the room. They had expected gratitude, relief, immediate acceptance. My pause introduced uncertainty that they couldn't easily manage. Over the next few days, the tone around me grew warmer. More check-ins, more appreciation, subtle suggestions about my future here. It wasn't coercive, it was persuasive, and it came too late, because the window for quiet fixes had already closed. What they didn't realize was that the offer, however generous it looked, couldn't address the misalignment I had documented. Accepting it would have required me to take formal responsibility for problems I still wouldn't have the authority to prevent. It would have made me complicit again, this time with a title. And titles don't protect you from consequences. Documentation does. I declined the offer, not dramatically, not with accusations. I thanked them. I explained that while I appreciated the recognition, I was concerned about the clarity of ownership and decision-making authority. I said I couldn't accept expanded responsibility without structural alignment. The room went very quiet. This was the first time I had named the issue plainly, without emotion, without blame, without apology. And suddenly, the problem couldn't be smoothed over. They tried to reassure me, to suggest adjustments, to frame things as evolving. But the moment had passed. The truth had been named clearly enough that it couldn't be unheard. After that, things moved quickly. Conversations I wasn't part of accelerated. Reviews were triggered, documents were requested, questions were asked by people who hadn't needed to ask them before. The system, realizing it couldn't buy comfort, had to face accuracy. I wasn't celebrating, I was preparing. I knew there would be fallout, not dramatic, but structural. And I knew that whatever happened next would redefine my place, whether inside the organization or outside it. But one thing was already clear. The version of the system that relied on my quiet labor was over. They had tried to fix it with a promotion. They had underestimated what had already shifted. Because once someone understands the difference between recognition and responsibility, they can't be persuaded with symbols. And once truth is named without heat, it stops being negotiable. The confrontation, when it finally came, was nothing as the word suggests. There was no raised voice, no accusations, no dramatic unveiling of evidence across a table. It happened in a small conference room with neutral lighting and carefully neutral language. The kind of room designed to keep things contained. I was asked to walk through my concerns, not defensively, not skeptically, carefully. That alone told me how much had changed. I had prepared for this, not with talking points, but with restraint. I brought only what was necessary. I didn't lead with conclusions. I led with a sequence. I explained how certain decisions had been made, when they had been made, and what assumptions they were based on. I showed how those assumptions translated into downstream operational strain. I demonstrated how that strain had been absorbed quietly, without escalation, and therefore without visibility. I didn't say you did this. I said this happened. That distinction mattered. As I spoke, I could feel the temperature in the room remain cool. People took notes. They asked clarifying questions. No one interrupted me. There was no defensiveness, not yet, just attention. Then I showed the documentation, emails, meeting summaries, version histories, all time-stamped, all factual, all boring in the way truth often is. There was a long pause after that, not because anyone was shocked, but because there was nowhere for the conversation to go without acknowledging what was now undeniable. The system had relied on invisible labor to function, and that labor had never been formally recognized or protected. Someone asked whether I had raised these concerns earlier. I answered honestly, yes, repeatedly, informally, and each time they had been addressed in isolation, without structural change. I didn't say that with bitterness. I said it with clarity. Another question followed. Why now? I thought carefully before answering. I explained that the issue wasn't timing, it was readiness, that I had needed to understand the full scope before naming it. That acting earlier, without documentation, would have framed the issue as opinion rather than fact. That answer landed. There was no attempt to minimize what I had presented, no reframing as misunderstanding, no suggestion that I was overreacting. Instead, there was something more unsettling for them and more grounding for me. Acceptance. Not agreement exactly, but recognition. Recognition that what I was describing was accurate enough to require a response. The conversation turned to the next steps. Reviews, adjustments, oversight. Words like realignment and accountability entered the room. I listened. I didn't push. I didn't demand outcomes. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a disclosure. At one point, someone said, "We wish you had come to us sooner." I didn't correct them. That sentence revealed more than any argument could have. It assumed access without acknowledging receptivity. It assumed safety without examining the incentive. Silence in that moment was the most accurate response. The meeting ended without resolution, but with gravity, the kind that lingers. I walked out feeling lighter, not because anything had been fixed yet, but because I had finally stopped carrying something alone. What surprised me afterward was how little I replayed the conversation in my head. There was no adrenaline crash, no second guessing. I hadn't said anything that required justification. I hadn't escalated emotionally. I had simply described reality as I had experienced it, supported by record. That's the thing about confrontation without heat. It doesn't consume you. It also doesn't provide immediate satisfaction. There were no apologies that day, no public acknowledgments, no instant change. But there was something more durable. A line had been drawn, not in anger, but in truth. And truth, once articulated calmly, has a way of reorganizing power without theatrics. I didn't know yet what the outcome would be, whether I would stay or leave, whether the system would adapt or resist. But I knew one thing with certainty. I had spoken in a way that aligned with who I was, without compromising my values, without needing to dominate the room, without turning pain into performance. The confrontation had happened, and it hadn't required me to raise my voice. After the confrontation, there was a strange quiet, not the kind that feels tense or unresolved, but the kind that follows when something fundamental has shifted and everyone is recalibrating. Processes were reviewed, roles were examined, conversations I wasn't part of were clearly happening. I could feel the organization turning inward, trying to understand itself. My role, however, was no longer ambiguous. I wasn't treated cautiously, I wasn't sidelined, I wasn't suddenly elevated either. Instead, I was engaged with a new seriousness. Questions came with context. Decisions came with clearer ownership. When something wasn't ready, it was acknowledged rather than disguised. That alone told me everything I needed to know. I didn't stay much longer after that. Not because I was pushed out, not because things became hostile, but because the work I needed to do there, internally and externally, had reached its natural conclusion. The system had been forced to see itself. Whether it would change sustainably was no longer my responsibility. Leaving was quiet, intentional, on my terms. There was no dramatic exit, no manifesto, no final email outlining lessons learned. I transitioned my responsibilities carefully. I documented thoroughly. I made sure the people downstream from me weren't left holding uncertainty, and then I stepped away. What surprised me most in the months that followed wasn't relief. It was clarity. Without the constant background noise of managing misalignment, I could finally hear my own thinking again. I realized how much energy I had spent translating, buffering, absorbing, how little of that labor had been visible, even to me. Who I am now is not louder. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still deliberate, but I no longer confuse restraint with smallness. I don't offer silence automatically. I don't trade clarity for comfort. I ask different questions now, early, plainly, and without apology. I also choose environments differently. I look for systems where authority and responsibility travel together, where disagreement isn't treated as disruption, but as data, where recognition isn't used as currency to buy compliance. And when I don't find those systems, I don't try to fix them quietly from within. I decide whether they deserve my labor at all. There's no bitterness in that, just discernment. People sometimes ask whether I regret not speaking up sooner. The honest answer is no. Not because earlier silence was ideal, but because it taught me how power actually works. It taught me patience without passivity, observation without self-erasure. It also taught me that justice doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like alignment, internal first, external later. I'm no longer interested in being indispensable. Indispensability is a trap disguised as security. I'm interested in being respected in ways that are structural, not symbolic. That respect shows up differently, in clear boundaries, in shared accountability, in the freedom to say no without penalty. I still carry my notebook, though its purpose has changed. It's no longer a record of what I endure, but of what I choose. Ideas, reflections, plans that belong fully to me. Who I am now is someone who understands that quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over your participation, your energy, your truth. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. And clarity, once earned, is not something you give up easily. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a winner, to ask who lost, who paid the price, who finally got what they deserved. But that framing misses the point. This was never a story about defeating anyone. It was about exiting a pattern with my integrity intact. What I learned, slowly and without drama, is that silence is not inherently virtuous. It only appears that way in systems that benefit from it. Silence can be wisdom, restraint, patience, but it can also be labor. invisible, uncompensated, and quietly expected. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed calm enough, useful enough, reasonable enough, things would eventually align on their own. That truth would surface naturally. That good intentions would be recognized without needing translation. They weren't, not because people were cruel, but because systems don't run on intention. They run on incentives, and my silence had been an incentive for others to move quickly, speak loudly, and leave complexity to be handled elsewhere. The moment that changed everything wasn't the confrontation. It wasn't the offer. It wasn't even the documentation. It was the internal decision to stop protecting a narrative that required my erasure to stay intact. That's the moral center of this story. Not revenge, not exposure, responsibility. Responsibility to myself, first. To live in alignment with what I knew to be true. Responsibility to others, second. To stop absorbing consequences that belonged elsewhere. Responsibility to truth, not as a weapon, but as a stabilizing force. Quiet dominance doesn't look impressive from the outside. It doesn't trend well. It doesn't satisfy the urge for spectacle. But it endures, because it's rooted in self-trust rather than reaction. If there's a takeaway here, it's this. Being rewarded for silence is not the same as being respected. And when a system offers you comfort in exchange for clarity, it's worth asking what that comfort is really buying. I don't tell this story to encourage confrontation. Most situations don't require it. I tell it to remind you that you're allowed to pause, to document, to wait until you understand the full picture before you speak, or decide not to. You don't owe anyone your quiet just because it makes things easier, and you don't need to burn anything down to step out of a role that no longer fits. Sometimes the most powerful move is simply to stop carrying what was never yours. Before we end, I'd like to ask you something, not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever been rewarded for staying quiet, and only later realized what that reward was really costing you? If this story resonated, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!